All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Andrea Breanna. Andrea is the former Chief Technology Officer, or CTO, at the Huffington Post, and today she is the founder and CEO of RebelMouse, which is a next-generation content management system, which has helped build two of the biggest new media companies to date, the Dodo and Axios. I've invited Andrea here today because she's probably one of the best people in the media industry to comment on some breaking news, which is that BuzzFeed is acquiring HuffPost from Verizon Media in an all-stock deal. Andrea, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm very excited for this conversation because we, like I said, have some breaking news. But before we dive into this deal, I would love to start with some background so that listeners understand just why you're such a great person to comment on this deal. So let's start with your time at the Huffington Post, which more recently has been rebranded to the HuffPost when Arianna Huffington left. But how big was the team when you got there?
We were just 10 people at HuffPost when I joined. There were 2 people in the engineering team. And it was really Jonah Peretti and Ken Lear and Arianna, Catherine Zaleski on editorial and Colin on blogs. So it was this tiny team in a tiny office. And the site was exciting. It was becoming one of the most popular blogs. It hadn't quite become the most popular blog, but it had a lot of momentum. So it was like, 6 months, 9 months in.
Okay, and what was the thesis that Jonah Peretti, who we're going to speak more about later on, who again was the founder and CEO of the HuffPost and later went on to become the founder and CEO of BuzzFeed. What was the founding thesis, hypothesis, concept that helps you all want to get behind HuffPost?
Well, and just to be clear, Jonah was a co-founder. Kenny was another Ken Lear was the other co-founder, Arianna and Roy Seekoff. So it was between the 4 of them. I worked very, very closely with Jonah and Kenny, and I had worked with them for 5 years before. I had met Jonah in a contagious media class at ITP. And his love was creating stuff that organically was shared. And he had done some really fun projects. He was an adjunct professor. And so my last semester at ITP, just 2 weeks before classes started, a new class showed up, and it was contagious media, which was my love. I had for years before. I built a website for my dad's software company. And all my projects at ITP were related to contagious media. So I was like, oh my God, got myself into that class. And then Jonah and I really clicked, and he had met Ken Lear, and then Ken funded the Contagious Media Research Lab, which was really fun. It was Jonah put it together, and so Ken Lear funded it. Funding was silly. It was like paid for pizza and beers. We got some tiny check monthly. It was really insignificant, but it was really for the fun of this. And, Jonah's been very successful financially in the last years, but he wasn't making any money then. It was really like artists and weirdos. So it was him and Chase Palmieri, who's now a very famous comedian on Brooklyn Nine-Nine and like tons of things, has her Netflix show. She's amazing. And Corey Archangel, who's like an incredible artist that was one of the youngest artists ever in the Whitney biennial or whatever, really wonderful character, and Anne Pucharian. And we were just working on projects to see how things would go viral. Could we make them? Could we have a higher consistency rate? Because sometimes they'd work, sometimes they wouldn't. And then we did the Contagious Media Research Festival, which was like lots of people submitting things and us giving talks. And really, what made HuffPost so interesting, this is my version of the founding story, I want to make it really clear that it turns out that I think a lot of times when something's really successful, there are many versions of the founding story. So I don't mean to say mine is the version. It's a version. It's the one I tell and I believe it. I'm not, I think the way it happened was that Ken Lear was the real founder underneath it all. And he had been very successful in PR before, wanted to get closer to a media company, and he saw a big opportunity. At that point, Drudge Report had become really big and very important, especially in politics. And what Ken saw was there was no left-wing answer to the right-wing Drudge Report. So at the very minimum, he felt, this is kind of like there's a Coca-Cola with no Pepsi. And so there's got to be something that the left does to curate news quickly and give it a voice and make it popular. But Kenny was so smart. A lot of people who are, wealthy and have been successful and have an idea, they find someone to execute their vision. But Kenny always had a take that he didn't want someone just to execute his vision. He wanted someone to collaborate on the vision and make it even bigger than his own. And that's when he had Jonah as a co-founder, because what Jonah added immediately was like, yes, let's do the curation. Absolutely. And let's write the headline and make the splash and da-da. But there's this interesting moment in history now. We got to rewind to 2003, 2004, 2005, whatever it was. Blogging was the big new thing. And everyone was talking about blogging. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. Like, they didn't even really exist yet. Facebook was just going to start emerging as this tiny little app in Harvard at the time. But blogging was this big thing. And what Jonah realized is, like, a lot of people who are celebrities have a blog is perfect for, but they don't want to run their own blog. That's like a lot of overhead. And so he realized that it was a completely a beautiful opportunity for a contagious moment to take celebrities and say they blogged. Because bloggers at the time were seen as weirdos in their pajamas. Like, it was really like, you've got to go back to that time. So Ariana's a force of nature. She's amazing. And she really brought her network into it so that she could go get Larry David to blog, and on and on and on, and politicians and everyone, and get them involved so that you'd have a constant stream of, oh my God, did you see who blogged for HuffPost? But the reason I joined is because the vision underneath it was, this isn't a blog. This is the next big news company. And what the mission was, when Jonah and Kenny brought me in, because I had decided not to join HuffPost from the start, which was a financial mistake. But at the time, I had a really high salary at a real estate capital company. And so it just, like, I would have had to take an enormous salary hit to take the equity upside. And I don't know, I felt like equity things like that were a lottery, and I don't win the lottery. That's just how I felt about it. Later, by this time, they'd raised enough that they could make the salary more or less similar, and I could get equity and I could join. Really, I should have, in retrospect, without a doubt, joined. There's no doubt. It still turned out great for me, and I'm not complaining. It's just as a little note thinking back. But when I joined, the idea was that we were going to go through a transformation to be seen as a political blog, and instead to make the next leap to be seen as the New York Times and what comes after New York Times and Washington Post. At the time, it was this huge stretch. We were like a fraction of the size of New York Times or Washington Post. But Jonah and Kenny had done tests on what happens if you put entertainment content into the mix at HuffPost. And it performed off the charts. People loved it. So that was the mission, was take it from, it was like the fourth most popular blog. And first, complete the mission, be the most popular blog, but then start the real mission, which is like grow bigger than New York Times or Washington Post. And to get there, it was clear that we'd have to take all the thoughts on contagious media and how that works and apply it to technology and product so that a smart editor could join, and each story that they wrote or posted had the chance to be contagious media. And so we built a lot of tools in to understand Google fundamentally and how to win in search. And we did a lot of data analysis and iterations, and we hired the type of editors that were curious about these things. And those were the editors that grew, as the ones that would establish a big brand voice, like Sam Stein and Nico Pitney, that got an interview with Obama or covered the Green Revolution in Iran. But then also people who were extremely curious, like Craig Kennelly, Nico was too, and Catherine Thompson on entertainment, on how to get traffic to grow. And so we changed a lot of how, in the beginning, when I joined, Google Analytics wasn't even a thing. People used Site Meter, and it was so raw, so crude. And really in journalism, reporters, journalists, editors were competing for the front page. That was the sign of success. We worked with stats so that instead of just being recirculation traffic that you were recognized for, the number one thing you could be recognized for was creating new additional traffic, which we would call viral traffic. So if you got a link from New York Times, you got a big win in Google, you got tons of links from everyone, that would be the thing people celebrate, which was quite different from journalism at the time, where people had no metrics. Like at that time, New York Times reporters and journalists literally didn't know the stats on their stories. So what they would celebrate is, hey, you got the front page story, congratulations. So they weren't really actively participating in growing the audience. It was just catering to the audience they had.
Right. And in your learnings with contagious media, and obviously all of the work you did on the back end at the HuffPost to see which kinds of content were being shared, which ones were going viral. Obviously there's no silver bullet, but is there any kind of guide to creating more viral content?
Well, there's a lot, and that's just a huge part of the reason that I built RebelMouse, was because then when we sold Huffington Post to AOL, honestly, we hadn't even used the word CMS, which is what RebelMouse is a content management system. And we didn't even talk about CMS. We were talking about the platform and how virality worked and working with writers and editors. And so then when I saw the CMS world, WordPress, Drupal, and custom CMS, I inherited at AOL, at HuffPost, I was in charge. As CTO, I had product design and engineering roll up to me. And at AOL, then all of the AOL media properties, those groups rolled up to me there. So suddenly I had 18 different CMSs and 65 different web properties to absorb. And the whole point of the acquisition was to roll them into better technology and this better editorial approach. So there's a huge gap because CMSs were built largely by IT nerds who were checking the box. They weren't built by traffic junkies. And they also weren't built by writers and editors. And that's what I love, is working with writers and editors. I have stories published. I love being a writer when I can. And I love working with writers. And so the technology, and this is what RebelMouse gives to clients, the things that are the core tenets is, one, there is a core thing for a lot of stories. It's around speed to publish. The difference, if you can post a story on your phone on a Friday night because something just happened and you react to it in a smart way with an angle and a voice quickly, the difference from doing that on Monday morning when you get in the office versus Friday 30 minutes after it happened is dramatic. So there's one is just efficiency and speed to publish. we built, Axios now runs on its own technology because they raised $25 million in a B round, and those investors required them to own it. So we helped them fork it. But what we worked on to get them to 100 million page views a month was the editorial system being so fast they could brag about being faster to deliver a story than AP. So they would, every time they were, it doesn't matter if they were 30 seconds faster or 3 minutes faster, those were big wins for them. As people, as humans, like who we heard it from first, it's just like gossip. Whoever told you first, you notch up. You're like, oh, they're in the know. Then someone else comes by and says, hey, did you hear we certified Michigan? And you're like, yeah, I know already. So it's a massive, just like that happens with humans, all the algos follow it too. So speed to publish, most CMSs don't really respect hyper efficiency for editors. Usually editors are like, listen, we pay you and we know the CMS kind of sucks and we know it's kind of clumsy. So just fucking deal with it and check all these boxes and do all these fucking things and stop grumbling. Don't be annoying. We're paying you. Okay. And that's generally the relationship that managing editors and CTOs, et cetera, have to have with their writers. Instead, when it's like, listen, how could you have gotten that up faster? Is there anything we could have done so that you saved a step, saved a click? That ends up being really important. So speed to publish, so important. The second is that you actually have to understand this. You need tools so that every single time you publish a story as a writer, you start to understand this miraculous, it's really weird, and I think it's very beautiful that the way search phrases actually work, because it's kind of like Stephen Johnson's thing on emergence and emergent behavior. It forces you out of subjective and into objective stuff of how we act once there's 300 million of us. So what I mean is, let's say this tsunami in Japan happened. Is the search phrase that's popular Japan tsunami, or is it tsunami Japan? Or is it tsunami hits Japan? All of these little variations, it turns out that every single article, every story has a search phrase underneath it. And it's simple human nature is that if you heard about it, you hear that Emily, whatever her name is still not certifying the vote, and the GSA is who she's the head of, and you hear someone talking about that, what do you go search on Google to figure out what was that story and what were the facts on it? So is it GSA Emily? Is it Emily certified? Is it GSA certification? And if you begin to wonder and be curious about it, it's just like anything else. You can start to get really good at it through practice.
Yeah, it seems like Huffington Post and BuzzFeed really weren't doing anything super special. They were really just living and running a media business in the modern day. And it's kind of amazing how some of the media properties that have been famous for the last 100 years were so reluctant to innovate or lean into these new technologies, despite the fact that every year they could see that they were losing market share and advertising share to Facebook and Google, like you said. So it's like, if it's already happening, you have nothing to lose. You might as well lean in and start innovating. But I actually wanted to talk about Facebook and Google. My kind of thoughts here on the acquisition, BuzzFeed acquiring HuffPost, is that by them consolidating and joining forces and working with Verizon Media and all of the distribution that they have there, that now they actually have enough views, enough traffic that they can be an even more direct competitor with the advertising revenue that Facebook and Google have kind of swallowed up in the media space. Do you think that that is the main driver? And how, I guess if I had to ask you for percentages, what percentage of the acquisition is that approach, that strategy? And what percentage do you think is Jonah Peretti just having a desire to acquire one of his old startups?
Such a fun question. And I immediately got like all these DMs and messages from HuffPost people. And just for full disclosure, talked to Jonah about it since too, but just a little bit. I don't know the answer to that. So just, this is not like, oh, here's the inside secret and here's the full answer. But, you know, I think you're right that what happened in the last 10 years, if you go to 2010, 2012, those first like early part of this 2010s, there was tremendous opportunity for the media companies that would use Facebook and go with it and figure it out. And so BuzzFeed, after HuffPost was acquired by AOL, the true story is that Ariana and I had to go. They bought the technology. But the way the deal was constructed, Eric Hippo, Ken Lear, Greg Coleman, Jonah Peretti, huge forces in our success, exited stage right. And then a lot of people would tell us phrases like, I don't know why they dropped you into Vietnam. Like, AOL is a very dysfunctional company in many ways. And so a lot of mojo and momentum was just lost by being absorbed into AOL. Tim Armstrong was trying very hard to turn things around, but Patch was like this huge money-losing, confusing, not beautiful product. Just so many problems that distracted everyone, and so much just like, whoa, lost executive talent at the acquisition. So, for example, I loved working with Alex Ganaras, was CTO of AOL, and I really did like working with Tim and Ariana, but I missed working with Jonah and Kenny so much. So I think the thing that I mean, loyalty to a property where you actually go there on purpose is extremely valuable. I wrote a post with Josh Ellman, who is a VC at Greylock. He had launched, he's a friend, and we talked about the side door versus the front door. HuffPost had this huge front door. People would type in the domain name, go to the front page, and find out what was happening in the news. In the 2010 to 2016 or so, most media companies lost hope that that would ever happen again. And to be totally honest, I thought it might never happen again either. It looked like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all these other things were everyone's homepage. But there'd be some legacy homepage for like older behavior, but there'd be no new thing that would become someone's homepage. Then we built Axios, and I got to see firsthand the stats. And it's been tremendously rewarding and exciting, because it turns out if you build, Axios is built in what we call social UX for media. They recently went all AMP first, AMP only, and it's not quite the same. We're not doing their product or design. But overall, it still remains similar, which is it should act like social acts. Really simple to consume, endlessly scrollable, easy to share. Most, like the CNN homepage, when you go to it, it's a nightmare. There's 75,000 links. If you click one, you lost your place. You can't read any story without clicking it. Next load of page takes like 5 to 10 seconds. It's a nightmare. No one would ever go to that on purpose. So I think the hope for BuzzFeed by bringing together HuffPost is, one, bring back the mojo. HuffPost had this massive mojo, and it has this audience that loves it. So if you can bring back that mojo to HuffPost and you can bring loyalty, then it certainly has been a struggle for BuzzFeed and any other media company. Sorry, the sun is changing in my room, so try to adjust a little bit as the sun is changing outside. You want to have real loyalty and real direct audience. Because if you rely completely and only on Facebook, the key for me is managing the balance. The New York Times early years, where they crossed their arms at Facebook and didn't want to deal with them, was just as wrong as the companies that were built only on Facebook. The only way to build a real media company that has huge value is by combining them, where you use Facebook to drive the side door traffic, but a percent of those people you're constantly turning into your loyal people that actually type in your domain and come to you first. Because then you have real power in the relationship and you have this real audience to sell. Otherwise, what's happened to a lot of media companies today is they're reselling Facebook. And they're essentially like just a reseller of Facebook, where they're putting their ads up on Facebook and they're using their organic audience, but then Facebook cuts them off of their organic audience anytime they want to spend on it. And so it's been very difficult for media companies that went all in with Facebook to have a stable, predictable business. It also is really hard if you look at, like, we work with Alternet and Raw Story, and they're kind of like, oh, these gems from the late 90s that stuck. And their traffic is much more predictable because all of these people are totally loyal to them and go to them first. And it's just extremely different from the struggle that media companies have with Facebook on replicating virality. Like for BuzzFeed, Tasty was one of the biggest successes. It was Zay Frank has wonderful stories. He led BuzzFeed's video, and he's a genius. He was the other one in the Contagious Media Research Lab, by the way. He's just brilliant. I love Zay. And Tasty grew so fast on Facebook that Facebook started to rate limit the amount of friends that could join and fans because it looked like some hack. But it was the first time food videos had been done in this Facebook perspective. And oh my God, the way it took off. That's such a thrill. But as A. Frank talks about, the bad side of what we do, because I consider myself in it when you obsess with contagious media, when it works, you feel like a queen. You're on top of the world. It is the most thrilling feeling. When Tasty was happening, oh my God, that euphoric sense you could feel from Zay Frank and his team on what they were doing. But then you fast forward 18 months later and the growth rates have stalled and you're not growing anything exponentially. You know, the ways Zay talks about it, and I do too, is like one day you're on top of the world and the next day you feel like a total loser. And it's not that you lost all the audience. Tasty's still huge and big, but you get hooked on not just the size of a thing, but the growth of a thing. And that's really hard when you're relying on Facebook so much, or Twitter, or any of the social platforms, or Google too, is that they change their algos and human behavior. It's just harder to predict when something's going to go viral. So I think having this much larger audience to sell direct and not have to resell Facebook, which has been a real struggle for BuzzFeed. It also is harder for others to replicate because that's a big struggle too, is that Tasty got not just like what happens after Tasty and what happens, like Zay Frank figured out how social videos should work. And we're all used to them now. No one, like only 5% of people turn the volume on for social videos. So you have to have readable captions, and the readable captions have to be not boring. They have to be fun because it has to work. And you only have 3 seconds to capture people's attention or they left. And then you could keep them 30 seconds, but you won't keep them 10 minutes. All of those rules, Zay figured out. The problem is it's not proprietary technology that's hard to replicate. It's a format and it's easy to replicate. So, you know, we built the Dodo also, which is one of the giants of social video, and they were so good at it. There was some tension between BuzzFeed and the Dodo, and now this, because essentially it was taking all these visibly obvious formulas that weren't proprietary to BuzzFeed. There's no way to copyright a formula like that, but there is a way to go ahead and do them and do them right. And so now this is huge, massive. The Dodo's enormous. So is Business Insider, that's done a fantastic job with this. And there's a lot of others. Al Jazeera's done a beautiful job with it. So it's harder to protect. And having HuffPost and the Verizon properties and BuzzFeed together, that's not just like, oh, copy a format and then I'm going to have 100 million unique visitors a month on my site. It's way harder to get to. So it gives something truly valuable to sell to a brand.
Yeah, and you said it a moment ago about how the HuffPost has such a loyal audience, and it's actually something that BuzzFeed came out and made a statement about. They said, this acquisition is going to happen, but HuffPost has such a loyal audience, such a personal brand connected with their readers, that we're going to keep the two entities separate.
Yeah.
How do you think that that's going to play out? Do you think that they will stay separate over the long term? And I guess, how are the audiences of BuzzFeed versus HuffPost different?
Well, I think that it does make sense for them to remain separate, but Jonah's a very collaborative and creative person. So I can't imagine that they'll remain silos. HuffPost.com won't just redirect to BuzzFeed.com though, because what they'll do is they'll get very smart at recirculation between the two audiences and focus on the things that make each strong, so that each team can focus on that without getting distracted by doing the other things. So HuffPost is so beloved on its liberal take on news with a point of view. And BuzzFeed News has developed quite a bit of cred around this, but BuzzFeed News is a little better on investigative journalism on corporate problems and breaking down what happened at Uber and all these things. And so they have a different sort of, like, they've cracked investigative journalism that has big splashes. So I think they'll figure out those nuances in voice. BuzzFeed, the jewel of BuzzFeed is not really the older audience reading news and investigative journalism. The jewel of audience is that I have 4 kids. One is only 3, but give him 3 years and he's going to start sending me his quiz results, because the other 3 have done every single quiz there is and they're not bored of it. It's endless. Personality quizzes, which crown character are you? There is always a way to relate to modern current events through viral formats that BuzzFeed has gotten tremendously good at. We were back before COVID, we were traveling and I saw my 13, well, she was probably 11 then. We had a TV with access to everything where we were staying. So you could go to Hulu, Netflix, all of these. And she went to BuzzFeed. She found the BuzzFeed app and she sat there watching 3-minute BuzzFeed videos for hours at a time with her friends too. So I think BuzzFeed has always, that's the kernel of BuzzFeed. It's in the name. It's around these like popular current events and making viral formats that work with them. And they are tremendously successful at that. Whereas HuffPost has really made its name around like political news and hard news and from a liberal standpoint. And so I think they'll get really good at teasing each other's best elements. And what's nice about the world is like, older people often like to feel young too. So when you can mix the audiences together, you can find ways that you can take an audience that was thinking about, so stressed about whether Trump will concede or not, and find a format that is more fun and lighthearted. And I think that's where they'll figure out the right ways to mix audiences, seed each other. And, Jonah's so good at like trial and error based on data. And this gives him an enormous amount of data and opportunities to do that trial and error on.
Yeah, and my understanding is that Jonah was actually building or working on BuzzFeed as a side project while he was at the HuffPost. Is that true? And were you and the team aware of this side project?
Oh yeah, it was totally transparent. The thing when I joined was the concept was like, look, in a way, Jonah was the founding CTO. He's doesn't talk about himself as a technical person because he's never written code or done that type of thing, but he deeply understands technology. And he's had a commitment in his career to always deeply understand it and stay current on it. So when I joined, Kenny told me, listen, and Jonah told me, I'm starting this BuzzFeed and it's not a competitor to HuffPost. It later became a competitor after we sold to AOL and all these things happened, but it wasn't a competitor. But the idea, Kenny even told me, listen, if you need Jonah out of the way, just tell me, like if he's meddling or you're running the show here. And for me, it was like, Kenny, it's the opposite. I want as much Jonah as I can get. And we would G chat at 2 a.m. and I was very happy for him building BuzzFeed. And he was very committed to HuffPost success. So we would meet all the time. I felt I had a lot of access to Jonah's time. But it wasn't like some secret that he was doing it. It was all very transparent and open, and we found ways to collaborate. And Jonah he's such a creative genius. It was really fun to work with him and have his support on helping, because sometimes, managing the board, managing Ariana, she had so much energy, but it was really helpful to have him who understands technology and product and the limitations of it, and an engineering team that's small and what can be accomplished to help be creative so that we could accomplish this goal that Kenny or Ariana had, but in a different way than they envisioned, which was more realistic. And he's just an amazing creative partner. I'm working on that.
Yeah, and you said that you actually were able to speak with him, however briefly, since this acquisition, which again, I think is an amazing full circle success story to grow a new startup and then acquire the previous startup. It's kind of like a legendary move in the media property world. You were able to speak with him? Did you ask him how he feels, like how proud he is? Like what are the emotions that you were able to detect from him?
Oh, it was, just to be clear, a series of emails that we've done since. He's just so excited. It's so fun. It's such wonderful news. It's like, there's a feeling of HuffPost is back in the family, and it has this like huge mojo potential. So I think it's a very sunny, warm moment. And I think it's full of hope and optimism, because I think all of us, like Catherine Zaleski was a huge part of HuffPost's success. She worked very closely with Kenny and Ariana on the editorial side, and wrote a lot of the front page headlines and everything. And so we were talking about the way that it sold to AOL. I think a lot of us felt that the true potential of HuffPost was never reached, that we were on track for something that was much bigger, and everyone we did great on the sale to AOL. So people are like, what a horrible mistake. But at the same time, there is a sense of like, it was like this promising student that then fell off and traveled the world for a few years and now is back. So I think there's a sense of hope and optimism over what HuffPost could potentially become under Jonah's leadership. And I think that's what he's really excited about. And also, whoa, he was already dealing with a lot. So it's a lot of work he has ahead too.
Yeah. And what we're really talking about in a way is media consolidation. And I think a lot of people in the media space see media consolidation as kind of a natural outcome, like all the incentives seem to point towards more and more consolidation in media. Let me just get your thoughts on how that trend is. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it something that's going to happen whether we feel one way or the other about it?
Oh, I don't think it's so fixed, actually. I think there's you've got to separate the personalities in media. So if you take a Mike, this was a venture-backed business that's goal was to become a multi-billion-dollar company. It's going to be very, 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 very hard, way harder than it was before, nearly impossible. So I was really sad to see Mike sell for nothing to Bustle and just disintegrate. For me, that was like
$5 million was that acquisition.
really like sad and a bummer. And I don't think it had to happen to Mike that way. But they would have had to accept a new reality with a real company that they could make feasible and they could even make profitable and sustainable for decades to come. But that wasn't going to become the exit they had promised VCs. So companies that are in the most threat of folding, and I didn't love how Refinery 29 went to Vice either, to be honest. It's not bad for the founders given the state, but it's like there were a lot of hopes for Refinery 29 to become more. But how, when you have an office that size and a burn rate that size and all of these problems, how do you sustain that type of raising new capital? So I think those are the ones that end up consolidated. If they raise tons of capital, Mashable ended up going a similar route. If they raised a lot of capital and had a lot of VCs with a lot of interest. But we see and work with tons of media companies that are the opposite side. A Brit & Co., an Upworthy, a Raw Story, they go on and on, Motherly. These are independent media companies that are well run in a way that make more money than they lose, grow audience every year, and are really wonderful businesses to own. So they might not, they can pay teams, they can gain advertising dollars, they can have really great months, and their bad months aren't that bad, and they're not just money pits. Upworthy originally invested so much money in technology, same as Mashable, was sucking up all the chance to be profitable. That's another reason, just to be honest, of why I started RebelMouse, is all these media companies, if you have to have $5 or $10 million in technology investment a year, then you can't break even. But if suddenly all of that becomes like actually managed SaaS stuff that costs you a fraction of it, suddenly there's a couple $1 million of possible profit a year to share with your top writers and editors and yourself as a CEO. And then suddenly you see that there's a lot of these companies that actually the founder or CEO is living a very wonderful life. They're actually fantastic businesses, but in a lifestyle business sort of a way. So are they the next Viacom? No, definitely not. But are they a sustainable business that can have a big impact in the world, in their tone, in their reach? Upworthy can reach 7 million people a month. It's really cool. That's like as much as Manhattan, and it's with a tiny team. So I think there's going to be a lot of media companies that we see grow and that become sizable, and then the world is constantly changing. So that's one thing we know, is we have no idea what 5 years from now is going to look like in the media landscape. So in a way, just taking advantage of these opportunities to grow these audiences leaves all these independent media companies potentially in a really good place. There's this growing decline of how all of us feel about Facebook, and the open web built right might actually be able to battle social networks. So I think it's much more nuanced and interesting. It's not just consolidation. And there's really amazing properties that are run really well that will thrive. The hard part will be, and this is where we see, is like the bigger ones like a Vice, a BuzzFeed, Group 9, the larger new media companies, is can they put together the whole thing, the vision they have, so that it really validates a $5 to $10 billion company. Then it's really worth everything they've gone through. But if it's to become a really nice lifestyle business, then they really raise too much capital. So that's the big question that everyone's going to have to see in the coming years of what happens. It's not going to be resolved in a few months, especially in COVID.
Yeah. Well, I know you have a hard stop coming up, so I have two final questions that I ask every guest that comes on the podcast. But before I get to those last two questions, can you give listeners where they should go to follow you or follow RebelMouse?
So it's just at RebelMouse on every social account. So whichever is your favorite, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. On Twitter, the best way to find me is Google Andrea Breanna Twitter, but it's Andrea Breanna NY on Twitter, and that's where I'm personally most active. But emailing, especially if there's potential to work together, or you're working on a startup or something that I'd like to give advice and help others. I want to pay it back. I've been helped by so many people in my own life. So it's andrea@rebelmouse.com to email me.
Great. We at Credder will definitely take you up on that offer.
Awesome.
All right. So the last two questions here. First question is Bitcoin. Are you a believer or not so much?
To be honest, I'm so deep in my world of media and understanding what Google and Facebook are doing and everything that I just feel like I'm a total not expert in Bitcoin. So I'm going to take a pass on that so that someone who's actually really good at, I could give it's just not my area of expertise.
Fair enough. And last question for you today. Are we living in a simulation, yes or no?
I love that question. It's ever since literature has been my great love, and I think it's Calderón de la Barca in the 1500s in Spain who started to first realize that if the dream felt so real, or at least he was first in literature to start writing about it. I'm sure humans have realized from the beginning that if the dream felt so real, maybe what we wake up to is just a dream too. And so I would say we're in a simulation. I'd say, in a fun, imaginative way, we really have a tiny, tiny, tiny grasp of reality. I think we don't even know where we come from as humans. We are scared to tell our children that evolution is just a theory. My God, it's better than the Bible's theory, but we don't know. And I think we're scared to embrace how little we understand the world and our own past and our potential future. I don't know why, because I find it less scary in a demoralizing way and more exciting. Like I was, as a kid, I thought it was a little sad that they had already explored the rest of the world. Every continent and island has been mapped. And as I grew older, I realized that's 0.001% of the knowledge that we need to know to understand our world for real. So I'd say beginning to understand that the physical world and the reality we live in is a simulation in some way or another. It's very fun and triggers a lot of imaginative exercises that help us understand our reality better. So yes, we're living in a simulation.
Good. And to give you some hope, 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean, and only about 5% of the ocean has been mapped and discovered. So if you learn how to scuba dive, there's still plenty of room for you.
Absolutely. And we think we've been to the moon. We've never seen the center of the Earth.
Yeah.
We have only theories as to what's there.
Yeah.
So I think it's for those of us who are parents and stuff, it's really fun to think about how much more we as humanity will continue to make progress in breakthrough understanding. So I love that. Most of our reality is still unmapped.
Definitely. All right. Well, Andrea, with that, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Credder Podcast. We wish you and RebelMouse the best of luck. And I guess if any new developments happen between the BuzzFeed and HuffPost acquisition, we'll probably want to have you back to discuss. So thanks again.
I would be happy to. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for listening, all of you out there.